Good morning, everyone. Deputy Principal of the University of the West Indies, Mona Campus, Professor Ian Boxhill, Director at the Office of Student Services and Development, UWI Mona, Mr. Jason Mackenzie, Staff Advisor for the Debating and Public Speaking Society, Mr. Roger Bent, Staff Advisor for UWJC Debating Society, Mr. Javon Henry, President of the UWI Guild Council, Ms. Danielle Mullins, President-elect of the UWI Guild Council, Ms. Omalora Wilson, other members of the UWI Mona Guild Council, Moderator Jonathan Atkins, panelists, members from the media houses, our sponsor, Sagicor Group, special invited guests, club members, viewers, a pleasant morning to you all. It is in a true Sunday fashion that we are here to partake in the second staging of the UWI Mona Debate and Public Speaking Society's Multinational Perspectives. This initiative began at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic by the executive of the society through collaboration with friendships developed through our participation on national and international debating tournaments. The idea behind this event was to provide a platform for individuals of varying backgrounds to engage in wholesome discussions about issues impacting many nations. It is my honor as the president of the UWI Debating and Public Speaking Society to present to all of you, our guests and viewers, the UWI Multinational Perspectives, where our panelists will center the conversation on the focus point, censorship. The conversations held today are not for us to just discuss, but to expand our perspectives and explore ways we can guide the conversation locally and internationally with the aid of advocacy and policy development. That may be a huge leap for this society, but the conversation starts here and must be had now. I open this forum to you all as we start the conversation. Greetings again, everyone, and welcome once again to the second annual Multinational Perspectives Forum. This year, the topic is the evolution of censorship, and Mr. Jonathan Atkins will be serving as the moderator. Jonathan Atkins is the senior debater and immediate former secretary of the UWI Mona Debating and Public Speaking Society. He has represented the university at the World Universities Debating Championships, Thailand, and at the Pan American Universities Debating Championships, Panama City, where his team broke to the finals. He's a communications and marketing specialist. Jonathan has worked with a host of organizations, including the Ministry of National Security and Jamaicans for Justice. He's currently pursuing a double major in international relations and public policy, and is currently an online producer and reporter at the Nationwide News Network. Please welcome Mr. Jonathan Atkins.
Hi, greetings everyone. Hope everyone is hearing and seeing me well. Okay, just let me know in the chat if you're hearing and seeing me well. All right, welcome everyone to, Madam, our incoming guild president-elect said she's hearing me well. Okay, I said that as instruction. All right, so I want to welcome you guys to Multinational Perspectives. I'm really happy to have you guys here. This is an initiative of the University of the West Indies Debating Society, and I'm very excited for us to have a really rich conversation today. Okay, so we're going to start with our introduction of our panelists. We're going to start with our introduction of our panelists. So, all right. So first of all, we're going to start regionally. So we're going to start with the rose among the thorns this morning. So born in the beautiful Twin Island Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Tahila Maloney is a professional research analyst and graduate student of the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus, studying development statistics. A graduate of the University of the West Indies Mona, Ms. Maloney represented the university on numerous international stages for the United Nations Sustainable Development Student Network. Ms. Maloney is a former member of the University of the West Indies Debating Society, represented the university at the Pan American Universities Debating Championships in Panama 2019. She also studied in Sweden on a scholarship funded by the University of the West Indies, and she worked diligently towards achieving several other accolades upon her return. She currently lives in Trinidad and Tobago, where she is a research analyst. All right, so please welcome Ms. Tahila Maloney. All right, so I guess that was some.
Jonathan.
Okay, all right. So also we have Rashid Jha. Rashid is originally from India. He's currently completing his Masters of Engineering in Information and Computer Engineering at the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. Mr. Jha will be an incoming graduate engineer for Facebook company. They changed the name to Meta. So he's going to give us even a tech perspective on censorship and what that will mean for the digital space. So we have to apologize because one of our panelists is unable to make it due to some unforeseen circumstances. But in the debating community, we always have people who are willing to step in. So we have our former president, Mr. Ronaldo Blake, who stepped in at last minute and he will give us some added perspective. But also throughout the discussion, if I see people commenting in the chat, I might even ask some person to give their thoughts and their opinions. So we have a very intellectually stacked panel for you. And I'm encouraging you all to engage the comment sections with your comments and questions, and I'll be occasionally looking in to see if I can get some inspiration to how to steer the conversation for today. So we're really looking forward to a rich conversation. Okay, all right, so today we will be talking about censorship. So by the way, sorry, my apologies. I did not introduce our spontaneous panelist. Mr. Ronaldo Blake is a former president of the UWI Debating Society. He was also my debating partner who accompanied me to Thailand, Panama, and some other tournaments. Very much a pain in my ass, for lack of a more appropriate term, but he kept me intellectually contrite. So that's a pleasure. Also want to welcome Professor Ian Boxhill, the university's deputy principal. So that's big things. Professor Boxhill, I don't know if you want to say good morning or if you just want to just take in the air or the conversation.
Good morning. I just said that I would join you because obviously this is something that I wouldn't miss. I know you guys have been doing a good job representing the university, keeping the flag flying high. And even though I'm only here for 10 minutes, I wanted to indicate to you that by my presence, I completely support this initiative and will continue to support it. So continue and I'll listen. Okay, all right. Yes, yes, Tahila, all our panelists, I'll ask you to turn on your cameras at this point in time. Okay, and we see also in the chat, just doing some random big ups. So I see Mr. Javon Henry, the debating coach for the UWI Mona campus. Western campus rather. I also see our incoming guild president, Ms. Omalora Wilson. I also see our guild librarian, who I know also works alongside our debating society president, Mr. Andre Barrett, to put on this event. All right, so we're going to start with our panelists.
And we're going to start by just setting some groundwork before we continue this conversation. So first of all, I'm going to start with Miss Maloney. Since you are the first to be introduced, you'll be given the first words. What is censorship to you, and what's your understanding of the concept censorship? Mr. Hilo, Maloney.
Good morning, all. Censorship to me, in a very obtuse sense, is anything that goes against legislative freedom of speech. So for me, it is anything that decides what I can and cannot say offline or online in private spaces or in public spaces as a political entity or as a non-political entity, and anything that moves towards rules or guidelines in terms of what me as an individual can or cannot learn, and based on what I have learned or based on what I have observed, something that I cannot comment on, if that makes sense. Okay.
Well, you know what we always say in the debating community, everything makes sense once it's a perspective. So all right, let's start with Mr. Ja. Hey, what's up? Wagwan. That's the Jamaican way of saying welcome.
I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Okay.
And
what does censorship mean for you?
I think like censorship are like two types. So one is like what the country tells you cannot talk about, and then something like what you personally believe that you shouldn't speak or discuss. So I think that's how censorship is for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. All right. Ronaldo?
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. It's really happy to be here. So I would agree with both Rashid and Tehila. So it really it speaks about what restricts you at a state level and an individual's level. So you might have a case where certain things you really just don't talk about because talking about it could bring certain repercussions. And on the personal level, we really see that rising, for example, on social media, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later on. I think there could be self-censorship and there could be more general censorship that comes from the state, prevents you from talking about things that might be sensitive to the state and its interests.
All right, so I'm going to go a little deeper now. Starting with you, Mr. Ja, because I know you have two experiences. You live currently in the United Kingdom, but you're originally from India. How does censorship manifest itself, especially at the state level in both countries? If you could give us somewhat of a comparison.
I think in terms of India, censorship is firstly with how the press works in India. It's mostly pro-government. So you see censorship in that form. Then in censorships, you see how protesters are treated in the country. If they want to protest against any particular law or bill, there's some sort of violence that happens, and then they're labeled as anti-nationalists. India has banned, I think, all pornographic sites as a way of saying that we need to censor something which is immoral or is wrong. So that's how it's been in India as such. In terms of UK, I think it's comparatively a bit more free. Like you can discuss ideas, but I think in UK, I have seen more of self-censorship more than state censorship, where you're advised and told to you can speak about certain topics. We should not bring up certain events in that sense, I think would be how censorship, I believe, is different in these two countries.
Many of us have never gotten the experience to go to India, but I think a lot of us are a little intrigued by the fact that India is a democracy, and you say that the media is largely influenced by the state. Explain that to us a little bit more. Give us some context to why that may be.
So in India, there's a term called Godi media. So the term Godi means literally like media on the lap of government, right? So and why because so I think this is because of a few reasons. Firstly, the government kind of controls what sorts of advertisement that can be run on these channels. So there's a monetary side to it. Then most of these media sites run on something that's like called TRP. It's a form of rating, which is done by a government entity. So then again, they have to be more pleasing to the politicians. Another thing is like who are investing. So the private corporation which invests in these media houses also invest in the political parties and governments. So it's a lot about money, power, and how those dynamics move.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Interesting. Tahila, what's it like in Trinidad? Like, what's censorship? What does censorship look like, especially at the state level, or even, for instance, how companies also censor people in Trinidad?
I think in Trinidad and Tobago, this is a regional phenomena as well, where we have a lot of old values where we have a lot of old values in terms of what we do and do not believe that we can and cannot say. And I feel like this really reflects on how we approach censorship in the Caribbean, in terms that we don't see it as censorship. We simply see it as a value consensus doing what it needs to do, even though internationally and from another perspective, it can be seen as censorship, especially because things like state-owned and private-owned media continue to act as intermediaries between things that are happening in real life and the way that people are able to get this knowledge, and how it is filtered through that in terms of like states only or the government only hosting government events on the government channel, and what they're able to communicate through those means and through the government newspapers, and what they will and will not censor through that. And then we have competing newspapers who are against that, and people don't see that as censorship in terms of these media houses or these people are able to shift and change the narrative and omit things that they may not necessarily want out there in the public, but it is censorship. We may see it as, old values and people maintaining the rule of law and preventing anarchy, and really and truly what it is, it's a silent thing. It is you, the public, not having all the informed information to make an informed choice as a voter and an informed choice as a citizen. So I feel like as in Trinidad and Tobago, we don't have a perception that we're undergoing censorship, but it is very real and it is very alive within the space. So
Taylor,
yeah.
what's up on that? I'm a little curious. Rashid, forgive me a little. We're going to go into a little bit of Caribbean culture. I'm a little intrigued by the fact that, for instance, I see on Trinidad media, what's the politically correct term for this? But the Prime Minister in Jamaica, we like to call it daggering. He's daggering a woman at Carnival, and I see Trinidad media Carnival costumes being on the front page of newspapers, with women skimpily clad. And I know you said that you're speaking about value consensus. How do you guys come to those values? Because especially when you can see, is it largely political censorship, or is it social censorship, or is it selective based on the kind of culture, or even, for instance, does social class, race play a role in what is culturally censored?
I think what we have to remember as well, again, it's interpretation. So recently, one of my colleagues would have done a paper on Carnival and how other people might interpret what goes on within that space, and they see it as scantily clad woman and and for the average Trinidadian, it's a display of culture. It's nothing sexual about it. Even when we get into these spaces and we engage in these sorts of things, there is nothing to be censored, because let's be honest, sex in the Caribbean is a big censorship topic. If it leans towards that, it's a big no. But the reason Carnival is able to jump over these things is because there's a lot more to it than these scantily. Of course, they have something to say about that, and the way Carnival has progressed. But it comes from this underlying tradition and this underlying culture and this socially acceptable freedom, especially the placement of Carnival right before the Lenten season. It's almost an excuse. It's a pass to do whatever you have to do. Of course, if there are a lot of different things at play. I mean, the prime minister could do it as he is maybe a male, but if it was a woman in power or something else, the approach may have been completely different, and the reaction may have been different. But there are passes for certain things that may be again interpreted differently by outsiders to insiders, because it's only now that you brought it up that it even seems sexual or that it even seems wrong. But in my native context, there is nothing wrong with it. It's tradition, it's expression.
Yeah, it's interesting because the reason why I asked is because when I saw that picture of Prime Minister Keith Rowley, I said to myself, how would Jamaicans react if Prime Minister Andrew Holness had he had a girl in a daggering position on the front page of the Dean? I don't know if he would have been taking the same. But interesting. I want to ask you though, just before I get to Ronaldo, you spoke about the cultural and the interpretation. But if it was dancehall, a display of, for instance, dancehall culture, or the women were dressed in traditional dancehall attire, or that kind of depiction, would it have been interpreted the same, or would there have been more censoring of what the media published?
Of course, if anything, Trinidad is its classes. Carnival has benefited from being accepted by the upper class. So oftentimes, look at the girls on the cover. They look a certain way. They belong to a certain class of people. Even the band that is being portrayed on the front page is not your regular small band. It is mostly it is probably a frontline band, a big band with a big name behind it, with lots of girls who look a certain way and come from a certain class. So dancehall now has not been afforded this sort of social mobility. So we find that it will be frowned upon. It will be seen as something dirty or derogatory, and still has all those sexual connotations. But Carnival, because of its graduation, it is not afforded that same level of criticism. Now, if in your country Carnival is still maintained as something towards the lower class, you may find that it is also interpreted in this sort of way. But we have to admit, class does affect the way things are censored and what is shown in the media and who is shown in the media. So yes, it is true dancehall would have been treated with differently.
Ronaldo, what do you think, how big of a role do you think class, or even for instance gender, race, those things play in how we interpret, or how we even censor or what comes to us, especially from your perspective?
Oh, so I want to say the same approach where I speak a little bit about the state and the personal level. So there's this rule that Jamaica is either really bad at something or it's really good at something. And like press freedom is something that Jamaica is really good at, right? We're one of the freest countries when it comes to press freedom. So you do get that sense that political expression and state suppression are things that are not like, heavily regulated.
Stop on that.
Yeah.
Do you think it's time maybe? Because I'm always a bit conflicted about when it is that I hear that Jamaica is like ranked, how Jamaica ranked in terms of press freedoms, because I think, is it a thing that we only look on press freedoms largely through political lenses and what the press has access to in terms of reporting, or from just a governance perspective? Because is there an argument, for instance, in terms of the freedom of the press in social commentary, or even, for instance, cultural commentary?
Yes, I think that's an important point as well. If you should do the same kind of comparison that Tehila was doing about the kind of access that people of lower classes and socioeconomic backgrounds would have to the press, it would be less than others have, right? So there was a paper, for example, recently that looked at how lower income communities were portrayed during the COVID pandemic. And what we found was that it was really negative, right? It was this idea that these individuals were not able to like stay inside and observe the protocols, etc. So there is that aspect where, to some extent, the media does take a particular perspective that could lead to it self-censoring based on its perspective. But I do think to some extent the press is fairly free. My biggest issue when it comes to like state level and political censorship would just be the level of concentration of media in Jamaica. We don't have a lot of alternative media sources now that you see rising in many other countries. We do have some kind of online platforms that are doing good news, but for the largest extent, they get most of their news from mainstream press, you know? But there's like a second point to be made though about what's happening on the more personal level when it comes not to political censorship, but to censorship in other areas, where Jamaica is also a conservative country when it comes to the way that we are governed, not how people live on the everyday basis, but in the way that we're governed. It's a fairly conservative country. So sometimes I might be watching the TV and words that I would hear flowing very freely on Netflix, I hear being censored out on the local channels. And I always find that interesting because these are words that aren't particularly offensive, things that aren't particularly offensive, yet still there is restriction of the free flow of information. And I think there's this final point to be made about the kind of things that are brought onto the air in the first place. So you might not see certain types of content getting ever to TVJ or CBM, which are
on that point.
Yeah.
So I want to ask the panel, do you think that there's a fundamental difference in the censorship in how we should censor information? Hi, we would like to censor your mic. Whoever that is, just please turn off your mic. We're going to exercise some censorship right here. Okay, thank you. All right. No, but is there a difference between the censorship of information and the censorship of expression? And should we apply principles differently? Because I want to get into a lot of political conversations about, for instance, the censorship of, for instance, free speech or hate speech, or even, for instance, who determines what information is true. And that's why I want to ask the question, do we think that, for instance, the censorship, especially of information and expression really is leading towards paternalistic kind of state interference, that the state is really determining what you should consume, what you should say, and what they think is correct information? Starting with you, Rashid.
So in terms of information, I think then information expression. So I would go with expression is that we have comedians who crack jokes, and now in India, there are few things on which people don't like to crack jokes on. Religion, the ruling party, because these are the things which can get you behind bars. And so there is that, and people can actually turn up to your show, can break down the venue, and the police will actually tell artists that they should not perform at a particular venue because of the threats that the artists are getting. So in terms of expression, it has now gone from like there are groups now in the country which try to enforce their ideologies, and there's that form of censorship. And I think in terms of information, I think in India, it's like at least for the people who, like my parents, who only watch television, right? For them, the news is like the most important way and the most reliable source of any form of information. So the news only talks about how great the prime minister is, how amazing the country is doing. And we have meaningless debates on topics which do not relate to the country in any manner. So we would be discussing more about how our neighbors are doing. Like there have been more debates in our national news channels on how our neighbor Pakistan is doing, compared to issues like unemployment, floods in countries, lack of oxygen during COVID. So I think it's just informed, like, for the people who are older than me, like my parents and stuff, for them, they see the news that everything's going right, and they have their point of view. And like the people who are in my generation, like we do use other forms of ways to get information, which are not controlled by government in a way, because we have internet, we can go to different news outlets and gather information and then make our opinion. But I think this is how the governments are controlling, like, expression and
Interesting.
information.
Because I'm interested to know, how does a democratic population interact with a government that has such heavy restrictions on how people can express themselves? Does it affect how people vote? Does it affect, for instance, how political campaigns are run, or even social campaigns for public policy, or how does the democratic people in India, people who are exposed to democracy interact with that kind of censorship?
So there is a form of polarization on the basis of religion, right? Then there is a fear which is introduced in the common masses that, people of this particular religion are targeting people of this particular religion. So you should support our party because we will fight for your interests. Then there is always, there's always a fear of attacks from other nations around us. So, and how people from within the country are also trying to break the country apart. So it's basically controlling people by telling them that there is fear, that there's people who will do bad to you, and you should follow us, and we will guide you to, like, I don't know, like some sort of, we will provide protection to all your families and stuff like that. It sounds a bit like religion.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. Tehila, talk to me. What is your perspective? Is there a difference in how we censor information and how we censor expression? And should there be, or should there be none whatsoever? Give me your opinion.
I think there is a difference, obviously, because, for instance, we think information is something that is communicated to us, right? So, for instance, let's take what everybody's talking about, the slap, right? That could be considered information, right? And the reaction people have to that, as opposed to regular Trinidadians who are always in a fight somewhere, getting away with something, that is much less censored. Like in our interpersonal, somehow it's understood, like in that interpersonal expression, as opposed to when it comes across media, like, oh my gosh, there's an international da-da-da-da-da-da. Should there be a difference? I think that there will always be a difference, because people naturally have a cognitive dissonance. In Trinidad, we have a saying, monkey can't see his own tail, meaning that when we express ourselves, we don't necessarily see the impact of that, or are able to run that through our mind, like, will this be information? To us, it's just expression, as opposed to when we see the exact same behavior coming to us as information, like it's like we hold it to a higher level. We understand that things like this thing where they, for live streams, where they have a delay and those kind of things, those things are actually censorship, in terms of information being censored. The expression is live, but the information being conveyed worldwide is not. So there is a benefit to that stagger, to that people, how they judge themselves as opposed to how they see something online. So I do think that it should be different. It will always be different. Not because necessarily I have a profound opinion on it, but because I always feel that people will always judge something coming into them higher than they would judge themselves.
I want to shift gears a little and go a little bit more controversial and uncensored. For instance, when we talk about things like pornography, why do we think that it's appropriate for the state to censor pornography or even certain categories of pornography, whether it's written or even videoed pornography or even content? For instance, when it comes on, to a lot of websites, there are restrictions on pornography that idealizes rape or anything, certain things that have kind of racial leanings or so on. So do you think that states or even companies should really filter out what we as people with our own autonomous understandings of morality should consume? I'm starting with you, Ronaldo.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that question. Allow me to start. I'm
sorry, but I don't like why you seem so excited to talk about. You never seem so excited to talk about anything else. Okay, but continue. By the way, before you continue, those of you guys in the chat, I just asked a question. You can comment on it in the chat. I also want to hear what are your perspectives on the question about pornography. Should we be censoring certain categories of pornography, etc., or even things similar to pornography, like music that might entail a little bit like charge, whether racial stuff or charge sexual, highly sexual, or even violent kind of content. Yeah, continue now.
All right, so for the most part, I'm against censorship. I think most information that's available should be publicly available and people should be able to consume it. Of course, that comes with a lot of caveats because we have questions to answer. There are kids, young kids who are using the internet who might have access to this information. There are kids who are watching the television who might have access to this information, and it could impact their own mental and psychological development. So of course, there would need to be limitations. I don't know exactly where that is, but I would say maybe those limitations should be for the most extreme forms of violence and gore. But generally, like the things that usually come up more
stop. Just to understand you a little better, give me an example of an extreme form of violence, because what I might see, because personally, I saw what Will Smith did to be an extreme form of violence. Someone else might not see that as extreme form of violence. So what does extreme violence look like to you?
So for example, I wouldn't want to see uncensored video of someone who has been murdered. I don't want to see that. So for example, Instagram has screens and like first you see the image blurred out and they say this thing is graphic, do you want to see it? And I have the decision of choosing whether I want to see it or not. I like that because most of the time I don't choose to see it. There are some people who will even leave Instagram to go on a different website to go and look at something like that.
So you're saying that you prefer if they give you the option to choose whether or not. So like you're saying that warnings or screening.
So I'm fine with the option, but there also needs to be consideration of the fact that there are going to be kids who have permission at 13 to use sites like Instagram, and they might choose to do it even though they're not ready to see it, right? And the same kind of applies to pornography as well.
But question, is it the role of the state to do that kind of screening, or is it the role of parents or even children themselves to be able to determine what is appropriate consumption? Because that's what I'm kind of getting at. Where does the state draw the line, or even big tech companies draw the line as to what they think or their judgment on morality is?
So I think to some extent it's blurry because the state sometimes needs to legislate. If it was just up to the social media companies, they probably would not have made those kind of changes on their own. Those came about largely due to public pressure and some legislative actions that took place, right? So laws need to be passed to some extent to say, okay, there has to be a limit of what you permit on your platform. And at the same time, the social media companies need to look into, and of course, traditional media companies need to look at their own policies and their own, like what they decide to put out there. And that kind of communication with parents and people in the general population can allow people to make decisions about how they consume different forms of media. So like one of the things that I would completely censor, a couple of years ago, there was this particular dance in Jamaica called Walk Like a Dog and Cock Up and Urinate. I was not living in Jamaica at the time when that song was released, and the song was popular in the country in Trinidad. The song was popular there. I was deeply embarrassed as a Jamaican to see that as an expression of my culture. But I still believe that that is something that should be allowed to, like go on media, because it is an expression of culture. I might not agree with it, I might not like it, but people should be allowed to consume it. So
something that you said, I've put it to Tahila before I go to Rashid. Rashid, Ronaldo mentioned, like, for instance, extreme forms of murder, violence. But is it important, for instance, that we don't have filters on these things, that we know, especially for information, that we really know, can see what is before us? Because I think for a large part, before social media, we were largely dependent, or information, or the extent of the pervasiveness of something was largely new based on what the media chose to carry, or even the severity of an issue. Do you think it is important for us to, for instance, we kind of see or know from a censorship, we see the kind of gruesome acts, whether it's reporting or even if it is just for people expressing violence themselves, saying that I like violence or so on? Is it important for us to see those kind of things?
Yeah, of course, of course. I firmly believe I'm firmly against censorship, and let me tell you why. When you look at the history of the newspaper and the history of media sites and what they use to sensationalize their papers, it has been historically violence. But what it has done to a lot of people who were growing up and were literate in that age is cater that violence to something that they would be aghast to. So the media moves by what people value. So for instance, when it was coming up and there were all these racial tensions, you would see on the newspaper certain things about who was the aggressor, in terms of maybe it was a black man, maybe it was a brown man, against who is the victim. Maybe it was a woman, maybe it was a white woman, maybe it was a white man. And for me, the lack of censorship is actually what has allowed us to go beyond this idea that the individual is the enemy, and move to more bigger discussions about what if there was censorship on violence? What would we know about slavery? What would we know about the Holocaust? What would we know about states being violent against minority groups? What would we know about Ukraine? You have to ask yourself, how has this information benefited me? What would we know about the coup in Trinidad and Tobago if certain things were censored? To know who is the enemy here, and what are these systems in place that are creating these individual violent people? Like the idea that somehow we should be censoring these things is actually taking away, minimizing an issue, a very big issue, in terms of the people versus the states, or the people's ability to censor bigger, to hold bigger groups to account. I would be firmly against any sort of censorship, because how are we to know what is going on in the world? Violence, to me, and sociology teaches you, is a natural part of society, or it's very unnatural, but people will always have inclinations towards it. And deciding that you don't want to see violence actually takes the ability of the individual away to dig deeper, like what is the cause of the violence, what is behind the violence, what are they trying to silence, what are they trying to stop? So I would be very against any sort of censorship that denounces that. I think what we have moved towards is placing a lot of responsibilities on big corporations and the state, when really and truly there's a lack of self-responsibility. As you would have said, Jonathan, it is the responsibility of the parents to ensure that their child are not consuming certain forms of media. Like, I remember when the whole thing with Cardi B came out and people were like, oh my gosh, she's making music for and her child will see. No, Cardi has said that I am making music for adults. And that's a big thing in marketing. You are making content for a specific population, a specific demographic. Now, everything cannot be rated E for everyone. And there has to be some sort of choice for me, the individual, to decide what I want to engage in, what I want to see. As Ronaldo said, the filters are helpful. But in terms of completely taking it off, people will find their way around it. Especially like on TikTok. TikTok has banned all sorts of sexual media. People say corn. People say accountants to mean sex workers. People are creative. They're always going to find ways around this censorship. That is why it must always be on the responsibility of the individual to censor yourself and censor what you intake. So yeah, that's my perspective on it.
Okay, Rashid, what do you think? I want to hear from you.
I think the point is that it's yes, that you need some form of censorship. As Tahila just said, like you need to know about all these sort of atrocious behavior that has happened before. But like I want to know about why murders are happening, but I don't want to view that murder video, right? I can learn about it via text. I don't want to see a graphic image to tell me like how bad that was, right? In a way, is something. So the big tech companies and the states, they will only do at least for like social media, they will only do like the most minimal that's possible because they are private corporations and they work for money. Their job is not to please anybody. They just look for things which can gain more traction, and violence, as you just said, is something that people look out for. So some people might be like censored. So in a way, placing responsibility on social media is these tech giants is like taking a risk. So for that, you need government to either form laws which says, look, you cannot show people getting beheaded or something on your profile picture, on your profile site. You cannot share such videos in your family WhatsApp chats, right? You need some sort of control over like what is being shared. And so it's like it is pretty blurry, I would say. Like you want some form of censorship, but you also want to like let people know of what the bad things have happened before. So there's no perfect answer to it, I would say.
And okay, so we're going to, all right, thank you very much for that, by the way. We're going to shift gears a little bit. All right, so we're going to talk about history. Should we be censoring history? Because there are a lot of conversations about, for instance, like, how people express using political symbols not only in the digital space, but even, for instance, the history behind even symbols, statues, etc. Should we begin to should we censor history? Should the government play a role in censoring history? Because there are always conversations about, for instance, should this leader be venerated? This leader has a racist past. Should we no longer celebrate this leader, etc.? How do we approach history in the world of censorship, in the information age now, especially now as we have more and more social justice movements who now use social media as a platform, and they are engaged in efforts to change how people think about history, because a large part of the politics that plays out is based on how people interpret history. So how should we censor history, or how can we even approach censoring history? And I know this might be a very interesting one, because I know India has some form of a colonial past. They also have religion, deep-rooted issues as it regards to like religion and their history with Pakistan. Starting with you, Rashid, how does that even happen? First of all, give us a context of how people even attempt to censor history or even rewrite history in India, and what's your perspective on this? How do we go forward with telling historical stories?
So I think one way to censor history is obviously with education. So the education board takes steps to like remove certain parts from the syllabus which talked about certain incidents, or they try to include certain parts and try to exaggerate and try to make it really, really so that they can appeal to the emotions of a particular group. In India, we also have renaming of cities. So there have been few cities which have been renamed. so one example is Allahabad. It was called Allahabad, and Allah is like something related with Muslims. So they changed it to Prayagraj, which is more Hindu. So there has been name changes of places. And then there has been glorification of people who were like not well known, but they have ideologies which match a particular group. So those group people are now more vocal and saying like this person did so many great things, and they're just trying to like, it's like you try to make one star shine so bright that the other ones just kind of disappear in a way, right? So, and then there's obviously a sense of nationalism which is instilled in different points, and that's how you can try to manipulate history in a sense, I would say.
All right. Professor Boxill was indicating that he has to leave. Thank you very much, Professor Boxill, by the way, for coming. We really appreciate that. He's the deputy principal of the University of the West Indies Mona campus. Thank you for that, Rakshido. Interestingly, though, just for some more perspective, how in India's history, right? Just correct us. It's largely Muslim and Hindu. Who the governing party right now is majority which religion?
They are a Hindu nationalist party.
Hindu nationalist party, okay, and that's okay. And so what you're finding is that you're saying that in a large part there's some rewriting of the Islamic history to lean a little bit more pro-Hindu. Yeah,
because India was ruled by Mughals during a time period as well. So they're just trying to like cover up few parts of it in a way. So that's like renaming of places, bringing up past of some decisions that historical leaders took back in their time is also formed by what their perspective of the world was, right? In 1800s, 1700s, it was a different kind of world where different things were assumed to be correct and different things were assumed to be incorrect, right? So that's how I think now when you bring those points to modern times, all of a sudden they all seem incorrect, right?
So okay. Quick question, just for some general knowledge. Give us an example of a historical symbol or a political symbol in India that might be offensive, whether for instance, that the Hindus may have that might be offensive to the Muslims, or a part of history that might be offensive, or the other way around, that normally cause some political tension.
So we had people like Sarvakar. He was very Hindu nationalist, and he wanted India as a Hindu nation, right? On the other hand, we had Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who formed Pakistan, and he wanted a separate region for all the Muslims as a separate. He wanted to take all the Muslims and create a separate nation. Initially, his talk with the Mountbatten was with regards to like they wanted a separate electorate for themselves. And the current Indian powers were like, no, we will not give Muslims a separate electorate. And then he asked for a separate country. So these, like, if we talk about this scenario now, and if somebody says like, you know what, we will create a country which will be only of one particular religion, this is quite offensive in today's time, right? But okay. Back then, the tensions were different, ideas of people were different. So they went ahead with it.
Okay, that's interesting. So those of us who, if you never did go to JGO, you can learn some school challenge quiz. That was some added information there and perspective. Okay, Tahila, so you, for instance, what do you think about, for instance, the censorship of history? Because I know even Trinidad themselves have a very interesting history of, the Afro Trinidadian history, the Indo-Trinidadian history. And I know you guys are, you had that famous coup. And so are there attempts to rewrite history through censorship? What do we allow in books? What do we allow on the media? What do we talk about? What aspects of history do we talk about? Because before we continue, before we get to Ronald, I want you to because I want to open up the mic a little bit, because I know in Jamaica, I think my personal opinion is that I think that there's a little bit of censorship when it comes on to the 1980s that we don't, and 1970s, that we don't like to talk about that part of our political history. I studied history up to the highest level I could in secondary education, and we did not really learn about that. The most we learned about that was through about Grenada. So we talk about Grenada's dark political history, but our own wasn't really mentioned. So what's it like in Trinidad?
Well, there are 2 points. The first, in terms of the coup, I think what a lot of people have marked down in their own history as religious violence, what they have not understood as yet is that it was gang violence. It was gang violence fueled, not even fueled, but amalgamated by religion, in terms of that is what united them. But if we were to take a step back into the actual history, in terms of who was in charge of it, where did they come from, it was gang violence, which is why you find that there is no animosity towards any particular religious group, especially because the positive interactions with the group are better than the negative interaction. And it also goes to say that the international perspective of that religious group is censorship. And the positive view that Trinidad continues to maintain besides the 1990 coup actually goes against this narrative, and it is actually the one closer to the truth in terms of how many Muslims there are worldwide versus how many of them are actually committing to violence, and how much we have been brainwashed into this idea of who is violent and why are they violent, and this is a particular violent group based on our religion. And Trinidad has decided to not subserve themselves to that by maintaining good relations with our different religions and continuing in that multicultural society. The second is actually the point on history. To say that should history be censored actually suggests that history isn't censored. When there's a lot of censorship in history, there's history and then there's the past. There's history that we know and that is documented and that will be censored according to who was able to write it and who they wanted to convince on what particular fact. It is already censored. Women are written out of history. Lower class individuals are written out of history. Poor people and their contribution to the development of the region, the development of the world is censored. What we're actually aiming to do is de-censor history and rewrite it without the censors. History cannot be any more censored. Anything that we know about the past is written through the lens of those who could write about the past and those whose views we value. In terms of even when we look at women in development and WAD and GAD and gender and development studies, we're able to see the way that we think about ZOSO and the way that we think about structural adjustments and the way that we think about the people who would have been hurt the most is in this very broad sense, when really and truly, when the statistics show it was women who were the ones in the factories, it was women who were out there working in these particular areas, it was women who were affected by their closing and their reopening, and those sorts of things is censorship. This idea that we have to appeal to the voting population because adult suffrage, complete adult suffrage and women voting would not have been a thing all throughout history. And when you're appealing to the voting population, you write history and you base your facts on that voting population. And of course, that when we look at that and when we look at history, we find that only recently are all these people in history. Should history be censored? No, but it is already censored. So what we're actually moving towards is de-censorship. Any more censorship and everybody would be out of the books.
Okay, interesting. Ronaldo, what do you think? What do you think? Should we move? First of all, do you think Jamaican history in a large part, is it largely censored? Caribbean history, even Black history, is it largely censored? Do you think, for instance, there's certain aspects of history that we probably should censor? And I'll give you some more context, because let's say historical symbols like the Confederate flag that some people might find to be offensive, like Black people in America have largely come to the conclusion that this is an offensive symbol. Blackface is an offensive symbol. Movies for instance, you know, there's that whole conversation about Disney movies, and I want you guys to talk some more, add your perspectives in the chat as well. Disney movies that have historically offensive content in there that were used to capture history, the history of the time. How do we approach this kind of content, especially with our children, and what are the kind of restrictions that we put on the publishing and the continuous streaming or so of this kind of content?
When it comes to historical information, my perspective is that it's important for us to have conversations, very open conversations and meaningful conversations about what took place in the past. Because when it comes to what the states and what individuals do with history, you have people who just know history. So either you know a fact or you don't know a fact. And then there's like another level where you start to apply this history. So I know that this has happened in the past. What am I going to do with this information? It kind of speaks to what Rakshit was talking about when he was identifying those kind of religious differences and how it would have been used by one side to kind of oppress the other, or maybe try to win some more power. So in my opinion, history really should not be censored. I think history is best when it's uncensored, but unfortunately, as Tehila said, it's written from a perspective. The history that we have consumed for a number of years in the Caribbean, it's changing now, but before it was largely written from a European perspective. And,
okay.
Yeah.
But I put a direct question to you because I want a direct answer. If it is that we have, for instance, a film that shows slavery in a way that we know Black people or interpretation of history to be incorrect or based on our own historical documentation. For instance, that shows that Black people love, because there are films that show that Black people were happy in slavery, etc. Should we censor that kind of film? Is that a film that we should allow on our TVs, or you know, should people have access to that kind of film?
That's a difficult question. Personally, I would say we should censor it. I would say if it shows something that is clearly historically inaccurate, it's not a work of fiction, it's not clear that it's a work of pure fiction, then that should not be something that is broadcast to people and like something that's consumed as historical fact.
But are we robbing people of their creative licensing? Because if I decide to rewrite a film now of Black people, let's say, enslaving white people as somewhat of a creative licensing, and it's social commentary, are we putting restrictions on the kind of creative licensing that people have for their own form of social expression?
There is a slight distinction in that one of those things definitely did happen and could very closely mirror the kind of thing that we're seeing portrayed incorrectly. And one of those things definitely did not happen, and just seeing it as like a work of fiction. So if you watch Bridgerton, right, for example, no one would ever imagine that in the Victorian era, there are so many Black people who were living in the United Kingdom and they were so affluent, right? So that's clearly a work of fiction. But if you looked at something that was different, right, more racially homogenous, was portraying a particular region, but it was clearly portraying the people who were there in an incorrect way, and it might be interpreted by a lot of people as being something that was actually what happened, then that should be censored. If it's not banned completely, maybe it could have a disclaimer. This thing doesn't really portray what happened, right? This is a historical inaccuracy or whatever, but I think there needs to be some kind of distinction between what is historical fact and what is fiction mixed with fact and what is just pure fiction.
All right, I'm going to move into the Q&A a little bit, but we're going to do a little activity, and I'm going to put some scenarios to you, and you're going to tell me censor or not to censor, and briefly tell me why or why not. So, Vladimir Putin spews misinformation about a war and why he wants to enter a war. Should we censor or should we not censor him? Okay. So, I'm supposed to pick who goes first. Okay, starting with you, Tehila. Should we censor or not censor? Remember, succinctly, please. Time is of essence.
Not censor.
We censor. Okay.
No, I wouldn't censor. No, don't censor because it offers a new perspective.
Okay. And okay, interesting. In the chat, tell me, Vladimir Putin, misinformation about a war. Censor or not censor? Tell me in the chat. Going to open up the mic soon for everybody else. Rashid, what's your opinion on that?
I would say not to censor as well. I would be like, let people see like what a particular person is saying and what the views are, and then make their own judgment if they want to follow such leaders or not, and let the world know about what atrocious activities he has done.
Okay, Ronaldo, censor or not to censor?
Not to censor. Allow their perspective to come across and let us filter out that information.
All right, somebody in the chat, somebody quickly volunteer. Tell me, would you censor or not censor? Tenny says, no, let people see that he's really evil. So I'm getting from that perspective that people are saying that we need to see the unfiltered truth of what people are up to. Okay, a next scenario in front of you. An Israeli Zionist spreading misinformation or anti-Palestinian rhetoric. Censor or not to censor? Okay, starting with you, Ronaldo.
Once again, I would say not to censor. Once again, there's like a lot of information that we could get. So if one perspective is not fully accurate, there are other sources of information that we should probably be referring to make an informed decision, not to censor.
What happens if the person is using a platform? This Israeli Zionist is using his platform to call for violent acts meted out against the Palestinians.
I think the laws of Israel relating to hate crime and threats to the safety of a person should come into play, and that person should be prosecuted on that basis.
So that means you are asking the Israeli government to censor?
No, they're not censoring. That's
censoring. If there are repercussions for your freedom of speech, that's censoring, in my opinion.
Well, if your freedom of speech crosses a certain threshold, then it's
censoring.
Well, you'd have to decide if you're going to do it. You have the right to freely say what you want, but
Rashid, yeah. what's your opinion? Do we censor that person?
No, I would agree with Ronaldo here with that there is a particular law, right? Many countries have their constitution, and wherever they have a mention of freedom of speech, they explicitly mention like what are the exceptions. If you're trying to cause some sort of public disorder or something, then you are accountable for your actions. It's not completely like you can say whatever you want. So,
well, I mean, as a point of just consideration, I don't really think that the Israeli constitution prohibits hateful language against the Palestinians, or is so they're so insulted by violent rhetoric towards the Palestinians. Taylor, what do you think? You censor that person or not?
Censor. Let's censor them because it's violence against a marginalized group, and as Rashid and Ronaldo said, it incites violence. And freedom of expression doesn't mean freedom from consequences, because either way there will be consequences, either the violence or the law.
All right. Okay. Wait. Someone put a question in the group. So what? I'm somewhat unable to, I'm not seeing that question properly. If somebody could read it for me,
Which one?
In the meantime, I believe it's from Sashana.
Okay, so that reads, hi, good morning. I agree to the extent that everyone should be able to see and know what they wish. But what about censorship in environments like schools, all levels, including minors? Should we not be censoring what children are seeing in environments where parents are somewhat out of the picture and somewhat unable to protect their kids? That's from Sashana De La Pena.
Interesting. I want to encourage the panel to think about that a little bit, and we'll get back to that question. Next scenario in front of you, the Taliban. The Taliban, should we censor an organization like the Taliban? the Taliban, for just for context for those of you, the Taliban is an organization within Afghanistan, and they're actually, contrary to popular belief, they're not just a terrorist organization. They see themselves, or they identify as a political entity. However, they spew anti-United States or Western rhetoric. Should we, and let me put it in this particular context, should we, as the United States or a Western country, censor the Taliban who basically spews rhetoric against your country? So put it in that wider context and not just from our own personal opinion. Do we think that a state should censor the content coming out of their sworn enemy? Starting with you, Tehila.
No, of course not. The United States are no large untouchable entity, and just because they're being targeted does not mean that we should be censoring the Taliban.
Okay. All right. Rashid, what do you think?
I would agree with the same. Like, you cannot censor just because you're a country in the West, right? Like, you have to listen to what the other side's perspective is, and that it's somewhat similar to like saying, like, just because I don't like what you speak, I will not allow you to talk.
All right. All right, cool. That's interesting. Ronaldo, I'm going to give you the next one. All right, this is the last one. Boko Haram. Boko Haram is carrying out atrocities in Nigeria. They have taken more girls hostage. Just remember, this is a scenario. We're not really wanting this, but they're taking more girls hostage, and they're sending out content on social media with these young ladies, and we carrying out violent acts on them. That Boko Haram's normal train of violent acts include rape and dismemberment of the female body, etc. Do we censor them? Starting with you, Tehila, I'll give you as the female in the group to go, and then with you, Ronaldo. And the last question after this, just want to ask you guys, do you think after this, we're going to have a quick conversation and we're opening up to the panel to everyone for question and answer? Do we think that as a global community, we need to look towards international standards and conventions to govern censorship, especially as it regards to social media, because companies like Facebook, Twitter, etc., cannot continue to act as if they're organs of a particular state? Should they be given neutrality under through international law? So before we go to that, Boko Haram, Tehila.
There are two sides to it. I think that they themselves and the media coming out from them I'm on the border about censorship, because they benefit from social media presence. It gives them an avenue to recruit, to publicize.
Let's say they were doing this on their Instagram page, like they were actively doing this. Should censor?
No, yeah, censor, because like they're benefiting from that. Like, violence is being propagated and encouraged through this, and actually Trinidad is having an issue with this, in terms of we're having people leaving Trinidad and going across to these Middle Eastern countries based on what they see on these Instagrams and these whatevers. So yeah, censor, because they benefit from this.
Who you think should do that censoring though? The company or the state?
I think it's up to the company. I don't think that states should involve themselves in censorship, especially on a private company's platform, and involve themselves in that relationship between the individual and the company. I think one of the parties have to do it. But in terms of news about the party and Boko Haram and what we're seeing on international news, don't censor.
Oh, interesting. Hold up, because we're going to that's going to come up in the analysis of the last question, because if you're going to ask the state to ask companies to do this, aren't you now enlarging the political entity of these social media companies? Boko Haram, Ronaldo.
I wouldn't censor. I remember in 2015 when ISIS was taking hold in Syria and Iraq, one of the things that really galvanized global support against that group and led to a lot of pushback was seeing American journalists being beheaded simply for reporting in the area.
But Ronaldo, mind if I ask you, sorry to interrupt you, but you said before that you were a little bit against displays of violent acts and you think that should be censored. So why is it different with Boko Haram?
So I think it's different in terms of it's a bit nuanced. So it's a military group. It has done this kind of thing before. And it's important for us to actually let people see what's happening in these extreme cases. The social media companies still would have that option to censor to some extent what you're seeing. So there's a blur and you decide whether or not you actually go and see it. But I think things like that should be accessible. They are important to the world. It's not just one particular incident with a specific person. It's not like something that's continuing every single day. So I think it's important for us to see that, especially because seeing something like this could actually rally support that gets people to stop it. Whereas some things that you see on the TV every day or some things that you see on social media every day, it kind of just becomes normalized and there isn't really that rallying of political support to stop it.
Okay, all right, Rashid, and you get the honors. Boko Haram, would you censor that kind of content?
Well, I mean, yes, in terms of like the videos of people that they're posting to encourage violence, but not about the news. Like let the news about their atrocious behavior be available to public, and whomever wants to like research about this topic, let it be accessible in that sense.
All right. Last question. We're going to have a conversation quickly. Should we now be moving into a global consensus or a global kind of framework for social media companies, platform companies? Because I think media has moved from I broadcast to people broadcast through me. And should we now be looking into global conventions that these platforms are no longer to kind of strip them of their political influence, but through censorship? Because if you can censor the kind of information that I receive, we see now, especially in the Russian-Ukraine crisis, that a big part of this war is who is winning the information war. And we see how, for instance, President Zelensky's chops as an actor, as a comedian, is actually influencing how the war actually turns, because it's influencing Russian soldiers' morale and Ukrainian morale, Ukrainian resolve. It's actually influencing how people in other countries perceive the conflict, etc. How Russians perceive the conflict, how much teeth Vladimir Putin now has. So if you can censor, where leaders or even people who have influence in international politics, you actually are playing a role in this. Do we think that needs to go? Because what might happen is that they might, we need to allow for all thoughts to be contending on these platforms. So should we have international conventions? That's it's Facebook, Twitter, these kind of things. You really don't have the right to do this. Everyone should, once you're a world leader, you have your blue tick. Oh, sorry, I was speaking Jamaican Creole. You should have your blue tick and you should be able to tweet, regardless of whether or not we think you're an asshole. You should tweet, you can put out your pictures on Facebook, you could do whatever you want, you can spread propaganda, because we want all the information out. And this is a free space. We don't want the United States government coming down on Twitter to tell them to something there, or China coming down on ByteDance and saying control what happens on TikTok. So what do you guys think about that? Starting with the computer engineer in the virtual room. What do you think about that?
I mean, you just cannot allow anyone to say anything. I think Donald Trump was asking people to drink disinfectant to cure COVID. And when a president of a country is making such kind of claims, you have to understand that he is risking lives of many people. So like you need some sort of censorship to stop people from stating wrong facts as if they are legitimate, right? So we need some sort of censorship there. Then the talk about United States of America controls the narrative with like these tech giants is somewhat correct, because they do control it in, say, United States, but in India, the Indian government as well controls what is being shown out. In Russia, the Russian government has control over what's being shown. So it's just every country has their own type of model, which these social media platforms have to follow. So, and saying that you want to take this away, and they will just make these social media companies just not be able to function, right? Because the government always has power over private corporations, right? If a government doesn't want you to exist in their country, they can make it happen. We have seen it in China. Facebook is up, right? So these private entities are actually not having that much bargaining power with governments in terms of what they can and cannot do. They always have to follow some norms and guidelines that are set by the ruling parties in any nation that they are part of. That's my point of view.
Okay, Taylor, what's up?
For me, I think that they should have, like, as you were saying earlier, and I actually agree with Rashid in terms of allowing them like certain things that could incite violence and stuff. But to me, that's just the platform guidelines. Like nobody should be above these guidelines. Nobody should, just because you're a president, you get to start a riot or do whatever you want to do. If you violate the guidelines, you're off. And you should not be allowed to just tweet anything that you want to because you have the blue tick. No, they may be more likely to get kicked off because they might quicker break the guideline than somebody else. But that's not the platform's fault. That's your fault. You have to abide by the platform. Like you are not a president above the Twitter guidelines. You're not a president above the TikTok guidelines. You have to follow it the same way. So yeah, I actually agree with a lot of what Rashid has said.
Okay, Ronaldo. And after this, we're opening up the floor.
I think on a like multi-governmental level, I wouldn't agree with like a UN agreement on censorship, because I think most agreements that are made at that level are just so broad and general that they tend to be ineffectual, especially when it comes to states having the ability to just opt out of parts of those agreements that they don't like. And the fact that there's some countries that have disproportionate amounts of power in the UN who would be able to influence the direction of those agreements. What I do see now, however, is something that I kind of agree with, where, for example, the European Union usually plays like a leading role in legislation on some of these issues, and they tend to be a lot more stringent with big technology companies and how they operate. And having that kind of development taking place along developments that are taking place in other jurisdictions could be an effective way to manage them. So there would be limits that are set on the companies, but they would still enjoy freedoms to operate in various jurisdictions that might vary. And that could even allow people to still have access to information, even if it's, for example, being censored in their region, because they could use something like a VPN to get around any blocks that exist and get information from elsewhere. So I think that kind of regional approach or that national approach is probably the best one, instead of something that's more global in scope.
Okay, all right. So we're going to open up the floor for anyone who wants to make some comments and or ask some questions to the panelists rather. Just indicate with the show of your hand, and I'll call on you. Okay, and not all at once. Okay, so some comments in the chat. Propaganda and misinformation causes chaos and also incites violence. No, let people see. Don't censor so that they can get the whole truth and make an informed opinion. Okay, that's an interesting perspective. All right. Just in closing though, members of our panel, just tell us overall what do you see, for instance, what you think is the future of censorship, and you know, how do you think it will impact the global political space?
Jonathan, what about the question and you chat about children and
oh yes. Oh, please, yes, address that before you make your closing remarks. I'm sorry about that. Yes, about censorship in schools where parents aren't there, and what that will mean for you know, children, and should we censor? Should we censor in those school spaces, and who should be doing the censoring in these school spaces? All right, starting with you, Tehila, since you remembered.
I think something like that would be akin to ban books, and I am firmly against anything like that. But also, what happens during a school term is always premeditated, and a discussion can be had with like the PTA to kind of confirm all the topics and negate all the topics democratically. But to say complete censorship, school is already the engine of society in terms of it is churning out a new generation of workers, and it will always be censored based on what a society thinks that they will need in the future. And a more open idea to the schooling system is to actually remove those censorships and to allow children to learn very freely, which is why we find a lot of people moving towards homeschooling, because they want these ideas taught to their children, or they want it taught in a particular way. So we have a lot more conflicting ideas and a lot more people with conflicting identities out there in society. So I'm against censorship in the school, but I do think some things can be discussed preemptively before the school term starts. In closing, I really enjoyed the conversation. I thought it was riveting to hear all the different perspectives from the different countries and to hear how multinationally we approach censorship and the views that we have on international issues, and whether or not we should close those lines of communication. It was very enjoyable.
All right. Rashid.
I think with education, I think there's also a talk about trust between the teachers and the parents and how the communication between these two parties are. I think in certain countries, they have some type of parent-teacher associations where parents and teachers both actively participate in trying to frame up a curriculum for the children that are studying in schools. So I would say, and like censorship from a very, I don't think you should try to like make a very narrow view for a kid, allow him to see the whole world, because they've just started learning about the world. And if you're just going to narrow what they can see in the world, then I think that would be detrimental for them as they grow on. When they will, because if you teach a particular idea, it might happen that when they grow up and they meet somebody with a different type of idea than what they have, this can cause some sort of, you know, like some sort of questioning of themselves, where like, but what I was taught was right. Like, I think like in North Korea, where everything is censored, right? People there believe that, you know, the dictator before Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il, actually, when he was born, the birds started singing in Korean. So, I mean, you don't want that level of censorship to cause some sort of this conflicting ideas.
Thank you very much, Rashid. I appreciate that.
I had a great
time. Lastly, Ronaldo, and then we take a question from David or a comment from David. Someone.
Yeah. So, listen. Each child in a school is exposed to the same information that the most careless child is exposed to. And that's a fact. Whenever kids go to school, they speak very freely, informally at break time and lunchtime. They view all kinds of information. So it's really difficult to censor. So I would echo Rakshit in saying that there is some way that parents and teachers can work together to say they should probably prevent like the most extreme forms of images and stuff being fed to their children. But also schools should be a place where you get access to a ton of information and a ton of different perspectives. And that should help to shape your worldview, because you're going to go into a world where you're exposed to different people and different backgrounds and contexts, etc. So it's important for you to get that exposure early.
All right. All right, thank you very much. I want to thank the panel. Before the panel goes, David had a comment to me. David, you can open your mic. Carla says, I agree with Rashid and Ronaldo. Kids ought to be educated about the real world and learn to develop learn to develop their own views on these issues. Yes.
I have two questions for the panelists. The first question is this. There are some who argue that parents should censor what their children, the content their children are able to receive, and that given they have a major role in shaping the minds of their children, they should have that ability to censor. Do you agree with this assessment, or do you believe that having or encouraging parents to censor certain content may, rather, or not encouraging them to censor certain content may undermine their roles and responsibilities as a parent? That's the first question. The second question that I have is in the case with defamation. There is some internationally who argue that we should not have defamation laws on the books, given that they may violate freedom of speech. Do you see any context where defamation should remain as a penalty or as an infraction on the books, or do you think that it should be treated more as a civil case where if persons feel defamed, then they should be able to carry an individual to court?
Okay, Loaded. I starting with you, Tahila.
To the first point, in sociology, they teach us that the family is the primary mode of socialization. So whether or not we want the parents to play a role, they are going to play a role. They are the first point of contact. They pass on everything from language to behaviors to habits to why you need to be in therapy at 25. They pass on everything. And therefore, it is their responsibility to be active and to be really aware of what they're passing on and what they allow their children to intake, understanding their role as somebody who is shaping a mind to go out into society. In terms of defamation, it should definitely remain on the books, especially in the Caribbean, where our politics seems to go all the way left from the facts into something much more derogatory and dirty. I think defamation laws actually help guard against us going too far that way and keeping closer to what we're supposed to be discussing in brief.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Tahila. Okay, Ronaldo, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So on the first question, I don't necessarily think your role as a parent is undermined if you can't censor or kind of filter what your kids are exposed to. To some extent, you have to teach them to be responsible about what they consume and what they view. But in a world where kids have to have access to technology in order to function and to grow and develop, they are going to come across things that they probably should not be seeing in the first place. And as a parent, there's only so much you can do to prevent that. Now, on the second point about defamation, I would agree with Tahila and say that it should remain on the books. And I think that could actually help to protect freedoms of speech, because what could happen is if someone in power has precedent where someone who is opposed to them has said and continues to say things that are defamatory and that are incorrect, they could use that as a legitimate excuse to pass stronger regulations to prevent free communication. And that could then go and affect things that are not defamatory and things that are perfectly correct and perfectly fine to say. So I do think it's important for those kinds of laws to remain and for strong punishments to remain in place, and of course, other options being available to victims as well.
Okay, Rashid.
I think in terms of undermining a parent's role, I don't think that's true. Because in a way, when your child has access to everything, they also bring it up in conversations with you. So you get a platform where you can now discuss with your child about certain topics, and you can talk with them about why you have a particular point of view regarding this. And this just allows the kid to grow and learn more. Um, in terms of defamation, I didn't hear the question properly. If you could repeat it, that would be great.
In basically, David was asking, should we still have defamation laws? Am I correct? Yep, that was my understanding. If we should still hold defamation laws, and are defamation laws basically affront to freedom of speech?
I mean, in terms of defamation, personally, I believe that the current legal ways are appropriate for it, because at least in India, it's like if you have an issue on defamation, you take it to the court and the court decides if what's being said is appropriate or not. And I don't want to like tamper around with it a lot, because what can happen, I think Ronaldo was talking about as well, is that they can use it as a mechanism to say bring in even harsher laws in case it's completely removed. And they can say, like, you know, they can use pinpoint examples of people who just keep on violating it and then introduce a harsher law, I would say.
Okay, nice. All right, so I think my job here is done as moderator. It was a pleasure to be your moderator. The panel, you guys were exceptional. You know, the level of intellectual fortitude was there. No need for no stoppage, no additives or anything like that. You guys were good. Rakshit, big up yourself. Yeah, that's the Jamaican way of saying thank you very much. So Antahila, I think you understand Jamaica. You lived in Jamaican language, so big up yourself as well. You lived in Jamaica for I believe it was 3 years. So I want to thank you guys very much. It was a pleasure having this conversation, and I hope we can continue to have this kind of international dialogue more and more. Yeah, I hope you guys can tell the panel thank you in the chat. I now hand over to Mr. Andre Barrett, the president of the University of the West Indies, Debating and Public Speaking Society. Thank you guys all for coming out. I'm Jonathan Atkins, and I was your moderator for the conversation. Hand over to Andre for the closing remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you confirm that you're hearing me, please?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes, we're hearing you.
Okay. Okay, very well. I must apologize for not being able to turn on my camera. My Wi-Fi is unstable and I don't want to be told, right? So good afternoon to all again. I did a great pleasure to deliver the vote of thanks on behalf of the Debating and Public Speaking Society here at the University of the West Indies, Mona. I want to express sincere gratitude to all those who have made this event a memorable occasion. To our moderator, Jonathan, we thank you for presiding over this event and guiding the program so ably. To our panelists, Rakit, Tahil, and Ronaldo, we're honored to have you in our presence. Indeed, the best ideas emerge when very different perspectives meet, and it has been refreshing to hear different perspectives on the idea of censorship and what it really means to you. To thank you, members of our tech team and the event planning committee working assiduously behind the scenes to this event ran smoothly. To our sponsor, Limited, for underwriting the whole event. To the Guild Council, gratitude for providing this platform. And of course, to the wider audience, we appreciate your support and engagement, and we hope that you will continue to support the initiatives of the UWI Debating and Public Speaking Society. We thank you all once again, and it is my hope that you all will have a productive week and that you will stay safe. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Denise. At this time, I'll now deliver the closing remarks. First and foremost, I'd like to express my appreciation to the moderator and panelists for their valuable contribution to the Multinational Perspective Forum, the Evolution of Censorship. My deepest gratitude goes to all who attended the forum and assisted in making this such a successful event. A few takeaways from the discussion are: it's the responsibility of the individual to self-censor from unwanted information, and where children are concerned, parents indeed play a strong role. Where the state and big tech have a strong role in censorship policy, it's the responsibility of censorship lies with the public to force these giants into upholding and transforming censorship policies. With total censorship, it is expected that members who are interested will go around the restrictions, and thus the use of filters are a more suitable alternative. And being heavily censored with history, the aim should be to de-censor history through education. And where censorship of history comes in, we ought to limit censorship to grossly inaccurate details. Viewers, this event has opened our eyes on censorship, and it is now our responsibility to keep the conversation going and mold our societies in the direction of our perspectives. I invite us all to take part in the virtual buffet we have and interact with each other as we bring this Multinational Perspectives Forum 2022 to a close. Thank you all.
And you shouldn't joke around with buffets, you know, that's very dangerous on a university campus. You guys seriously like made a virtual buffet?
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. This was a good discussion. Oh, Roti. Like, you should have said linger on that Roti a little bit.
Where's the naan though? Like, hello, where's the naan?
Can you work with Roti and